Are you sick of talking about player agency? Because I think I'm kind of sick about talking about player agency. And the reason is that people treat that like it's a toggle, a switch, a lever. Player agency, no player agency. And so there's really not much nuance in the conversation. People will talk about, does this impinge player agency? Does that not impinge player agency? But none of these distinctions, to me, are very useful. And the reason is that, well, everything constrains player agency to a degree. Now, when we're talking about player agency, I'm really talking about choices. Do the players have choices that they can make? And the conversation can get a lot more granular than that. How meaningful are the choices, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to get in there. In fact, most folks, when they throw out player agency, don't try to qualify it with a bunch of terms. So I'm not going to either. I'm just simply talking about player agency in terms of, do the players have choices, yes or no? Recently, I saw arguments, discussions going back and forth about whether modules take away player agency. The answer is, in a sense, of course they do. Of course they constrain player agency. Everything constrains player agency. That's really not the issue, either with a module or with a campaign, whether it's pre-written or homebrew or improv on the fly. The question isn't, or shouldn't be, does it constrain player agency? Because there are always some constraints on player agency. It's a dial. At one end, you might have wide open, which would be complete and utter player agency. And I don't know what that would look like since, again, something always constrains it, whether it's just the physics of the game world or the geography or the landscape. Where folks care about player agency and how that dial is turned is when it gets turned down enough that the choices that should be there in the context aren't actually there. The players look at a situation and their characters see in the fiction, and there should be choices, and yet the dial's been turned down enough that it doesn't feel like the choices that they ought to have in the world actually exist. When the player agency issue becomes really important and really worth talking about. But just saying whether something does or it doesn't answer any of those questions. We're not talking about the quality. We're just saying, yes, it does. No, it doesn't. And much like with, I guess, just about every discussion in the tabletop role-playing space, it's not very helpful. I could see a lot of folks who might be coming onto the internet for the first time, or that sounds weird, coming onto maybe tabletop social media, and they run into these arguments, and first they have to sit there and type into a search engine, what is player agency? And then they'll get all kinds of manifestos and diatribes one way or the other, and then they'll watch videos and listen to podcasts and people saying, yes, player agency, no, this takes away player agency. It's not something that is just binarily taken away. Is that a word, binarily? Isn't something that is just on or off. It's that dial. There's some kind of range, and you want to be in a green zone on that range. And that green zone, for me, is where your player agency and the context of the world basically line up. The players can look in the world and they have pretty much the same amount of choices as it would seem that they do for the world. There are 3 exits out of this room. You've got choices of 3. If 2 of the exits for some reason are never openable, they can't get them open no matter what they do. They can't blow it up. They can't disintegrate it with the disintegrator ray. They're just stuck. They literally look like they're just painted on the walls, and they only have recourse to go out through the other door, even though their characters can see 3. I would say you've left the green zone. We don't need to worry about modules and things impinging player agency if they're staying in the green zone. Now, that's not to say that all modules stay inside this green zone. Sometimes you will find that a module, even though it might present in the fiction a number of choices, but then you might read further if you're the GM and you say, hey, wait a minute, this module only works if they follow a particular choice. Well, they're exiting the green zone. I don't know if green zone is probably the best word, but that's really what we should be talking about, is in a module, in an adventure, in a scenario, in a situation, do the player's choices line up with the context of the situation? Because that's what the players are going to be thinking about. It's when that dial for player agency starts to leave the green zone that players start to feel it. But as GMs, often we're very worried about these things way before they actually become issues. If you're looking at something like Curse of Strahd, it's a very big sandbox campaign. Does a game like Curse of Strahd limit player agency? Of course it does. You're in Barovia. You're not leaving Barovia until you've dealt with Curse of Strahd. That is a constraint. However, I don't think most folks would look at that module and say this is a poor module due to lack of player agency because it's a big sandbox, because you get to approach the problems within Barovia that you encounter in many different ways, and the module is open to you dealing with them in many different ways. Where you might look at a different module and say this does constrain player agency is in which it might present an open sandbox, and yet there's a very linear single path that you must take to successfully complete the module. Does this make sense? Am I off base in my assumptions or in my definition? Please save the comments over quantifying or qualifying, I should say, player choice. For the purposes of this, I'm not interested. We could talk about different values, the different sorts of player choices, and is some versions of player agency are essentially worth more than other types of player agency. I get it. I'm not having that talk right now. I simply want to talk about it on the whole, because most times folks just throw out player agency. But let me know what you think ultimately about the core of this issue. Are there ways we can talk about it that are a bit more intelligent, a bit more nuanced, and that can actually lead to better discussions? Because I find that just the yes, no, back and forth argument, maybe they get clicks and views, but I don't find them useful. They don't serve me. They don't help me understand anything any better. I'm thinking they might not for you either, but you let me know. Other than that, game on, and I will talk to you later.